So what if you're interested not just in the number of people who answered this question, but the behavior of the people in each of these categories in some other question? You can add more variables here to your same pivot table and compare them. So for example, if we go back to our Miami data spreadsheet, I'm going to go ahead and delete this filtered one. We don't need it right now. Delete. Yes, I'm sure. Okay. If we go back to this Miami data spreadsheet, we can see that in column CL, we have the variable we've been working with, local news pay. And right next to it, we have another variable called finance. And finance corresponds to a question that goes like this. Thinking about the financial state of your local news media, how well do you think your local news outlets are doing financially? So the possible answers are 1, very well, 2, somewhat well, 3, not too well, or 4, not at all well. You can immediately start to imagine some different scenarios. For example, people who decided to donate. Did they think that their local news were doing poorly and that's why they decided to donate? Or did they think they were doing very well and they decided to contribute to something that they knew was on the rise? So we can start to explore the relationship between these two variables in our pivot table. Over here, in our pivot table, we already have the variable of local news, paying for it or not, quantified over here. And we can add the values for the finance question along with it. So let's go ahead and click on Add button again. And we're going to scroll down to Finance right above Local News Pay. Click on Finance, and it's going to try and summarize by, I just made this column smaller, by the sum again, which doesn't make sense. Let's make this a different color. Let's make it orange. So in this orange column, sum of finance, we don't want the sum. We also don't want the count, because we're actually interested in how these two variables are relating to each other. So something that we might be interested in instead is not count unique or average. We can't use average because all of these variables are categorical variables, and averages only tell us something when we have a continuous variable. You can talk to me more about that to see if it applies to your data, but in this case, the average isn't going to tell us the information that we want. The maximum might tell us something that we want. That's under max. So let's see what the maximum is. So after we clicked on maximum, we can see that the value is always 999 because that's just going to be the largest possible option for anyone who didn't respond to this question. So over here in the pivot table editor, we can actually add a filter directly, just like we did before with filtering, just like we did before with slicer. This is just one other way to do it. Yet another way, we can add a filter. We can click on finance, which it's right here because we just clicked on it. And then we can say we don't want to show 999. We scroll down and we deselect 999. The check mark goes away and we click on OK. Now we can see that our pivot table automatically updated. We can see that the maximum now is 4. That it's the same for both of these. Oh, this is going to open a new spreadsheet. Sorry, I opened a new spreadsheet by accident. Delete that. Ignore that. So we see that the maximum for people who answered that they do pay and the maximum for people who answered that they don't pay is still 4. There were people in both categories who think that local news outlets are doing not at all well. We can go over here to the pivot table editor again and look for the minimum now, which is right under maximum. And we'll see that it's number 1. People who did pay and people who didn't pay, there were some who answered that local news are doing very well in both categories. So what if we want to find the mode? The mode is an alternative to the average, which in this case could give us some information because it's going to tell us which value appeared the most times. So to do that, we're actually going to exit out of this finance box, we're going to click on the X to delete it. And again, this is on the pivot table editor, values, and then finance. We're going to leave the filter alone. That's fine, but we're just going to delete this by clicking on the X. It's gone. So now our orange column is gone, but it's still orange, right? So we click anywhere else if we want to bring the pivot table editor back up. And we're going to do the same thing as before. We're going to add values once again. Click on the green add values button. Oops, it added local news don't pay. That's not what we want. Instead, let's do that once again. We actually want to scroll all the way down to the bottom, and all the way down here you can see there's an option called calculated field. And calculated field allows us to add something that's not already an option up here. So we're going to click on calculated field, and we're going to tell it, because there's no pre-existing option for this, we are going to tell it that we want the mode of the finance variable. And by typing in this formula this way, there's many different formulas you could type, we are automatically going to tell it to look for the mode of finance. However, this is giving us errors over here. You can tell there's errors because of this red triangle, and if you hover over it, the error comes up. And the reason why we see those errors is because we're summarizing down here by sum. We don't want that. Instead, we want to click on this, click, and change it from sum to custom. Right now, the only other option is custom, and that's the one that we want. And now we have it exactly how we want it. We can rename this mode of finance. And actually, this turned out to be not as different. You know, they're both 2, which is the answer somewhat well. But it's interesting because most people who pay for local news and most people who don't pay for local news, the most frequent response from both of them was that local news outlets are doing somewhat well financially. So we can actually say, because of this, that regardless of whether or not people pay, they still think that local news are doing well financially.